Hi and welcome. I'm Alexis Moran with AOS's Manufactured Interior Construction team. Welcome to our Breakthrough series. This is a disruptor speaker series that we'll be sharing with you throughout 2022. This is the first in the series focused on funding a brighter future. I'm sure if you turn on the news or read a newspaper, you are hearing about the education industry, and that's because it is focused on now more than ever. There's an unprecedented amount of federal funding contributing to this evolution of educational environments. And Suzanne Dumas and I are going to present 5 themes that we're seeing in that sector regionally. The first of which, integration of technology, using technology to enhance these spaces, using it as a learning tool. In this space at St. Joseph's Abbey, the walls become part of the learning experience. They can be used collaboratively. You have access to technology throughout this space, and it's also acting as that privacy element as well. Here, it's showing in reception spaces. So it's making that accessibility to students who are coming to this one-stop space at Xavier. Information is accessible there. And here it's advancing this CMU block wall, that had been serving one purpose for a long time. It's now enhancing the space, providing technology in a lobby area, and also has the ability to be accessible and change out and modify as the space requires. In large auditorium spaces, more accessible to students so that there can be distancing, but they can still understand the content being shared from the presenter from multiple angles, or creating collaborative study spaces so technology can be used there as well.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Dumas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the student and faculty experience and what we've been seeing in the latest trends over the past couple of years, and share that with you as well. The first is Makerspaces. We have seen pretty much every new educational environment incorporate a makerspace of some sort. And I think that goes back to hands-on learning. Way back, it was the teacher stood at the front of the classroom, the students were in their desk, and everyone was writing and taking notes, and that was the end of the class period. But now we know that learning takes shapes in many ways and different forms, and a lot of that goes back to that full integration and hands-on learning. So this is one in Baton Rouge that we recently did. This is one here in New Orleans with Sci-High that we did. And we did many of these throughout several facilities across the state. One other trend that we're seeing in education is breakout spaces. That also goes back to that collaboration within the classroom. So now where you may be in a classroom for a little while, you go out and get into breakout spaces. Sorry, old technical thing. And have huddles of, okay, we're going to work on this project this way, or we're going to do this presentation this way. So more and more breakout spaces are being incorporated into educational facilities. One other thing that we're seeing being revamped a lot are cafeterias and commons spaces. Again, these are not just rows of tables and chairs where you go and you eat and you leave. They are now meeting spaces, collaborative spaces, and a place to eat. Very, very inspiring. And these are a couple of the ones we've done recently where you can see, there's lounge furniture incorporated with tables and chairs. And last but definitely not least, another trend that we're seeing is the evolution of the teacher workroom. And what does that look like? Used to, teachers had all of their papers and books for the last 30 years, and they carried them with them and had them in their space. And now that we're going more to integrating technology, there's less of a need for that. And a lot of workrooms for teachers are going to a more touchdown type space or hoteling. And yes, still there are sometimes permanent spaces dedicated, but more and more we're seeing these spaces become more flexible. And then we have outdoor spaces, and this kind of piggybacks on what we've been seeing with the evolution of educational commons areas as well as cafeterias. Most often, those then now spill out into an outdoor space for outdoor learning, again, being integrated into everyday classroom learning. And these are, this is one that we did in Baton Rouge, and here's another one here in New Orleans. This is right outside of the cafeteria, where we actually incorporated the retaining wall as part of the seating as well. So, and then sometimes we have the opportunity to actually create space outdoors. And this is an example of timber framing and how you can just take a wide open space and create, again, these little huddles and breakout areas for this outdoor learning. And I think Alexis is going to talk a little about sustainability.
So we are not only investing in the space itself, but investing in the future of the space. And more as students are requesting it, and educational organizations are implementing it, a sustainability initiative through manufactured interior construction, we're able to run a sustainability report. We actually shared this with our friends at LSU, sharing how they have mitigated waste, provided environmentally friendly solutions, and also been able to recycle some of the products used throughout the space. And they're creating this beautiful space within Pleasant Hall. Here, when we can design for disassembly and have this flexibility to reuse our construction method as our needs adapt and change. At Tulane University around 2007, we created this space where their program initially required a conference room space. Over time, that turned into an office, and then it became an office with 2 doors. So in early 2020, they called and asked if we could come in, in the span of one day. We reconfigured the space to create an enclosed office for a new doctor, and we're able to match that film as well, so that they're really getting the most out of their investment there. And then the solution is not going into the garbage. It's able to be redesigned and reconfigured for their new needs. Using manufactured interior construction, we can meet a multitude of sustainability initiatives and collaborate with educational institutions to identify their needs and help them achieve it.
And as we start to gear up to hear what our guest speaker has to say today, I wanted to talk a little bit about procurement options and things that we've experienced just in the past 2 years and how those look different than in previous years. One is private schools. Many of you know private schools also get funding from the state. If there is $1 of state money included in a private school, then that private school has access to state contracts. So in the case of this private school in Baton Rouge, we were able to not only use educational buying contracts to procure their furniture, we were also able to tap into state contracts. And we could compare the two often to see which one was most advantageous with pricing for the end user, for the client. And that just goes a very, very long way. We have a huge success story on this particular school where they have been procuring through a different method for years and years. And we just introduced this new thing. They were able to get the same exact product and save $15,000, which was a huge advantage. Then we have regular public schools that historically only use state contracts to procure. The state of Louisiana put legislation in place in the past year to now incorporate educational buying agreements into the public school system. And in other words, public schools can now tap into that resource. And so in the case of Denham Springs Elementary, we use some state contracts and we use some educational buying contracts, not unlike what we did for private schools. So this is an evolving trend and one that just gives much more offerings to those end users. And then in this case, this is a public school in New Orleans. They were given a grant through Louisiana Facility Planning and Control, which then did mandate that they use only state contracts. And so in this case, we furnished this whole building using state contracts. Very small piece went out to bid because they had to show that it was competitively bid in the state of Louisiana, but that was just a very small portion. The majority was able to be accessed off of state contract. So 3 very different ways of procuring, all on contracts and all basically able to provide total solution for each facility, which is huge. I now have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Steve Barr. Steve is with us today from Florida, where he works with VS America. And his background is education. He graduated from the Michigan State University and worked in that school system for 26 years as a CFO with several different counties along the way. And he really believes in the advantages of having agile furniture solutions in the classroom and throughout the school, because that increases learning and the capacity to learn in different ways, which we talked about a little bit earlier. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to take a deep dive into HEERF funding and ESSER funding, which is not new. It's just that now we have the ability to see that funding and use that funding in a way that we hadn't before in the classroom within physical space and FF&E. And he'll talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. As stated, my name is Steve Barr, and I recently retired, well, at least kind of retired after working over 26 years in K-12 and 2 or 3 years in municipal finance. So I worked about 30 years in Michigan governmental entities. The last school district I worked with before I retired the first time in 2017 was the Novi Community School District in Oakland County, Michigan. Novi student enrollment is around 6,500 kids. So in Michigan, contrary to the parishes in Louisiana, there's like over 500 school districts, pretty much by communities. So they had 6,500 kids. Oakland County, Michigan is one of the wealthiest counties in the country. Novi has the lowest free and reduced population in Oakland County at around 8%, 808. They had some of the highest test scores in the county and the state. They passed bonds with no problems. I was deeply involved in the 2014 bond where we purchased over $5 million of flexible and agile furniture for every school over about 2 to 3 years. I didn't believe in this agile furniture at first. I was sitting in a cabinet meeting with a colleague of mine in curriculum, and he introduced it to me because he knew the business office needs to buy into it just like the rest of the cabinet. So I said, what is this voodoo stuff? I started playing Jetsons music saying there's no way, this is not real. And then I went home one night and my son, who at that time was around 6th grade, was sitting on his stomach on the hardwood floor, and his tutor was sitting at the kitchen table. And I came home and said, why is Logan on the floor? Why isn't he sitting at the desk or sitting at the dining room table? And it clicked, and away we went. She said, it's not where you learn, it's that you're learning. It's whether you're standing up, you're sitting down, you're moving. My son, who's an ADHD, just needs to be wherever, not sitting in a plastic chair, a wooden chair, whatever. I retired, went back to work for a large Michigan city until I was asked to come back to K-12 3 months before COVID, not knowing what I was really getting into because none of us really did. And I went to work for Oak Park Schools in Oakland County, Michigan. So where Novi had the lowest free and reduced percentage in Oakland County, Oak Park with 4,000 kids and bordering the city of Detroit to the north has over half their kids come from Detroit. They have the highest free and reduced population in Oakland County, the wealthiest county in the country. Their free and reduced population is over 80%. 80%. Their academic rates, their students are achieving about 14% in reading. They hadn't passed a bond since 2008. They hadn't had the leadership in place to encourage the board to pass a bond. Their facilities are falling apart, so I was brought back to help them get their facilities and their finances up to speed among many, many other tasks, of which it all changed in March of 20, obviously, when we all had to audible and do something different. We passed a $54 million bond in May of 2021. Unfortunately, it's being spent mostly on infrastructure, MEP projects, because they haven't had a bond in 13, 14 years. So not the fun, exciting projects. The thought of a furniture upgrade was just a distant memory for them. Just a memory, a pipe dream, until COVID-19 and all these ESSER funds from Washington, D.C. They went from being a have-not for projects like this to a maybe we can do it now, because this 4,000 student district is getting $15 million of ESSER related state funds. Included in our application that I recently had to go back and help because there was a tragic death in their business office. I went back and helping them. Their application now has $3 million of furniture in there for ESSER 3. So it's pretty exciting to see things like that. Briefly, I want to mention just a traditional source of funding. And, a lot of this is on K-12 and there's some higher ed also. So, there's typically these buckets where you purchase furnishings type things, FF&E, general fund, which is typically where these COVID funds go, a special revenue fund, the food service fund. You would never think of buying these things from a food service fund until now. And you'll see why. Capital projects funds, where many of these purchases traditionally come out of, are bonds. And then we know a lot of higher ed has sometimes some very high funded endowment funds and capital gifts and grants. So general fund, we know that that's the sacred cow. Nobody wants to touch it because teachers want to get paid from there, administrators want to get paid, you got supplies you pay for. You don't usually want to touch that unless you really, really, really have to. So one of the things that's available is Title I funding. Title I for districts that are have a lot of students at risk, which I know a lot of, there are a lot of students like that all around the country, including Louisiana, receive a significant amount of Title I funds. And upon approval by your state, I'm confident that some of those funds can be used for agile furniture in this case. And then we'll talk about COVID funds in a moment. Food service funds, as one of the pictures Suzanne showed at the Commons, we did something similar to that in Oak Park last year, where we transformed their high school cafeteria into not just a cafeteria to use for 2 hours a day. It's now a before school center. It's an after school center. So instead of the kids going to the library and maybe studying, maybe causing trouble, maybe just doing what they shouldn't do, we're encouraging them to stay at the school and to use this cafeteria space, which transforms to a common space after school. And we think it's effective as it can be, obviously still with COVID, still rearing its ugly head. So what's happening with these food service funds? You would never dip into a food service fund for things like this. During the beginning of COVID in March of 20, most districts around the country were having like drive-up meal lines. And you would drive up, it might be at your community center, but it's usually at the high school, it could be every school. And they're serving meals, breakfast and lunch, to take home, heat them up when they're ready. So an example, you pull up and you say, I have 3 children. They don't know if you're from Novi, Oak Park, Anchorage, or New Orleans. No questions asked. There is no questions asked. You now give them, if they have 3 kids, if you do it once a week, 3 kids, 2 meals a day is 6 times 7 meals, 7 days is 42 meals. You're getting enough food for 42 meals. That's generating now a ton of revenue for the district. and low expenses gets mass produced food. So now these districts are generating a significant amount of, I'll call it profit, even though it's a nonprofit fund, similar to what a lower income school district would be all the time. The districts that are lower income and serve a lot of free and reduced meals generate a lot more federal funds than districts that are not low income, likely have a higher fund balance. Why does fund balance matter? Fund balance is what you're worth, what the assets or liabilities are. Why does that matter? There's a cap in these food service funds, what you can have. It's generally about 1/3 of your expenditures. You can't hoard money in there. So you could potentially do what we did and try and transform those cafeteria spaces, make them into common spaces. Maybe take something in a library or media center and make it into an after-school area, which also has some kind of cafeteria implications. But it has to be something dedicated in a, I call it a food service, a cafeteria type area. And again, it's got to be there. It has to be pre-approved by your state, just like anything else. But if you don't spend this money, it goes back to the government. The last thing you want to do is get it and give it back. So this is something that most people don't think about, that your fund balance is growing and growing and growing. The district that I'm finishing up with has about $1.3 million to figure out how to spend in the next 5 months, or it's going back to the feds, and we're not sending it back to DC. So you likely have to get approval from the state for things out of a food service fund. We haven't even dipped into the ESSER fund, it's all just food service funds. Capital projects, as many of you know about or have dealt with, significant amount of money in a school district, in a university or college, and the language varies, yet it's very similar in a lot of cases where it allows for these things, sites, buildings, FF&E, so on and so forth. Every bond app I've seen always mentions FF&E, furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So just make sure that's in there. Those get spent over 3, 4, 5 years, depending. So that's a traditional source of funding. Let's go into COVID funding. There's 5 phrases I want you to understand. The first is the CARES Act. The CARES Act is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Underneath there is where ESSER 1, and I'll call it HEERF, I'm not sure the way to say it, HEERF 1 for higher ed, reside. So under the CARES Act umbrella is ESSER 1 and HEERF 1, and that was signed into law under the Trump administration on March 27th of 2020. And we thought that was a lot of money. We thought it was a ton of money until December 27th of 20 comes, and then the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act brought over 4 times the amount of money that the CARES Act brought. First of all, none of us thought in March of 20 that we'd be here in December of 20, let alone January of 22. We never thought we'd be here. So they gave even more money under the Trump administration. He signed it before he left office. Again, a ton of money we'll talk about in a minute. Then 3 months later, the Biden administration signed on March 11th of 21, which is what we're going to speak about today the most, the ESSER 3 and the HEERF 3 under the American Rescue Act. It is over 2 times the amount of money that the previous ESSER 2 and HEERF 2, actually ESSER 2 was. So from ESSER 1 to ESSER 3, it's like 10 times. It's unbelievable money. It is unprecedented money that we would never expect to see. And unfortunately, we've had to go through COVID, and we're still going through COVID that made this a reality, but it's giving opportunities to some of these districts that otherwise would not have them in terms of some financial flexibility. So the first one, like I said earlier, ESSER 1 was signed in March of 20. The allotment of ESSER 1 was $13.2 billion. Louisiana got almost $300 million. So $287 million. That was allotted in 20 and have until September 30th of 22 to spend that. So that's coming up in about 8 months. So it's got to be received and really installed by September of 22. Most districts have likely spent that. They were buying PPE, they were buying technology, they were buying hotspots, they were buying the critical things just to keep kids going, keep staff going. So likely people have spent that like immediately. They never thought there was going to be a second wave. HEERF 1 had $14 billion and 147 million plus another $40 million. The restrictions there are actually a lot tighter in terms of when you have to spend it. It's 1 year from award and you get a 12-month extension. So really 2 years. Whereas you'll see in a minute with some of these ESSER funds, it's really like 3.5 years. We'll get there in a moment. So a lot of money. Now comes 9 months later, we're still here. ESSER 2 comes and HEERF 2 comes, and look at the amount of money. So we went from 13 billion to 54 billion in ESSER. I couldn't believe it. Louisiana's getting about 2% or $1.16 billion. Have almost 3 years to spend it from when it was enacted into law until September of 23. And then HEERF 2 again, 23 billion, 276 million plus 162 million. And the same thing, 1 year plus a 1 year or 12-month extension. One we'll focus on the most is ESSER 3. So here 3 months later comes more money. Another went from 54 billion in schools to 122 billion. Unreal. Of that, 2.6 billion was for Louisiana and have until September 24 to spend this. Originally, when ESSER 1 came out, it was like you got 3 or 4 months to spend it, or till December of 20. That totally changed. And then you can see the HEERF 3 money, almost 40 billion, and they all have different types of uses compared to what schools are. So again, significant amounts of money that never ever would have thought we would see. I'm going to focus these next few minutes on ESSER funds. So there's generally 4 factors that must be determined when determining if it's an allowable use of funds. And you'll see in a minute, there's 14 allowable uses of funds. The biggest thing is that you're responding to COVID-19. You're not building a new school with it. You're not paying salaries with it. You're responding to the COVID pandemic, including social, emotional, mental health, academic needs of students. There's all different ways you can get there. Does it fall under one of the authorized uses of funds that we'll talk about? Is it allowable under the uniform administrative requirements? That's just a bunch of accounting legalese. And is it reasonable and necessary? The 3 allowable uses have to be 3 things: reasonable, necessary, and eligible. We won't read these word for word. You know what those mean. For ESSER 3 funds that we're going to talk about now, because most people have probably spent ESSER 1 and much of ESSER 2 by now, that got a little more restrictive in that if you received, let's say you got 100%, 20% must be used to address learning loss. So you couldn't go out and spend, for example, if you got $10 million, you could not spend $10 million on HVAC upgrades to help the airflow and things in your school. That's not addressing learning loss. So it has to be evidence-based interventions dealing with learning loss, 20% off the top. So if you got $10 million of ESSER 3, $2 million goes towards learning loss. Now, I know there's some companies that have research that show that flexible furniture and agile furniture does affect academic performance. And if that's something that you can support and send to your state and have them agree with that, then you can use those funds for some of the agile furniture. The remaining 80% can come from these next 14 things we'll talk about. We're not going to talk about all 14. This is right from the U.S. Department of Education, and there are 14 allowable uses of ESSER 3 funds. The ones they've usually used to start out with were number 3, a lot of training and PD on sanitizing, purchasing supplies to sanitize. That was all the beginning. Number 5, and the one in bold, repairing and improving school facilities to reduce risk of virus transmission and exposure to environmental health hazards. That's the key one that we're going to focus on, one of the 4. Improving indoor air quality. Some districts are using monies to update their HVAC systems. Totally allowable, totally allowable. Another one that we think is very relevant for furniture is addressing the needs of low-income children and children with disabilities, racial minorities, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Number 10 is where ESSER 1 and 2 is used primarily on technology. 90% of the kids where I worked had no computer at home. No, not a computer. Mental health, you've heard all about this or experienced it with your own children possibly, that there's children, adults, staff that really needs a lot of mental health support. So we have to be careful that if we're going to hire a lot of staff, that we're able to sustain that after this money goes away in 3 years. Summer school, the more they can put into summer school, the more they're going to fund. Addressing learning loss we spoke about earlier. And the last one is number 14, which is really a catch-all, is anything you can do so you don't lay off staff. They don't want to lay off staff. They want everyone to be able to stay employed. And we know how hard it is to find people to work, whether you're working here, at a school district, at McDonald's, anywhere, you can't get people to work. So out of order, addressing student learning loss. These are 10 bullets that address how Agile Spaces can help student learning loss. And I'm not going to read through these word for word, but you can see how some of these help. Facilitating various teaching and learning methodologies like cooperative learning, student-centered learning, project-based learning. These are things that I know my son, it helped him significantly, and it probably is helping some of your children. Social integration, micro collaborations, breaking into small groups, large groups, going in the hallways, all different ways. Providing mental health support. Our spaces where it's easier to prioritize peer-to-peer and peer-to-teacher relationships. That's what an agile learning environment can do. Things that many of you have probably heard before. Addressing the unique needs of disadvantaged populations. Some of these children, their safest space they have is at school. So if we can offer them a personal private space, something with some boundaries, give them some self-regulation, awesome. Make it easier to integrate cooperative learning strategies. But the key one, and I think the simplest one, to be able to get your states to agree, because remember, anything you're going to apply for, your state Department of Education has to agree. There's going to be someone at your capital in the Department of Ed who is going to review your application or your subsequent amendment, because you're going to be able to amend these applications over time. And they have to agree to this. You may believe in it, but they may not. But we believe it's very strong arguments for improving school facilities. Mobile furniture fits through doorways, ensures schools can quickly expand into hallways, foyers, and gyms. Social distancing. I asked the guy in Michigan, I said, Kevin, I told him my background, I said, this is what I see. He goes, as long as it promotes social distancing, I'm all for it. It was that simple. We can sit here and talk about learning loss and mental health and stuff. He goes, as long as it's promoting social distancing, I'm all for it. Furniture built with constant change in mind, so you can rearrange at a moment's notice. Tables and chairs that can stack easily to allow easier cleaning of floors. I talked to him about that. I said, we can stack these things up 6 high, 8 high, 10 high, wheel them around. He goes, so you can clean the floors easier? I go, exactly. He goes, so COVID doesn't spread? I go, exactly. Furniture is easier to clean. So I believe truly that repairing and improving school facilities is one of the ones that really lockstep Department of Ed should agree with without any question. Again, you never know what they're going to say, but I believe that's one of them. We have many options of those 14 allowable uses. Other ones under ESSER 2, there was actually a allowable use that said providing principals and other school leaders with the resources necessary to address school needs. If that principal says, I want new this, new that, then you're meeting that goal of what they need. If it's reasonable, is it necessary? Yes. Then it's ESSER 2 money, it's sold. And the last one I said again was so that you keep people employed. The HEERF funds are significantly different. HEERF funds are a little newer to me until about 2 months ago when my son, who's in school in Florida, we got a small check in the mail or a deposit. I'm like, what's this for? The university didn't tell us one thing about it. And it's because they're returning funds to students. HEERF 1 gave money back to students that had a FAFSA application. The second one also, the third one also, and then there's anybody else also got something. So if you're in school, you got some refund of costs, whether it's tuition, room and board, what have you. So they have to give at least 50% of their money back to families and kids. That's off the top. That's a significant difference compared to K-12. And then the institutional portion, the remaining 50% could be more student aid, or it could be a variety of things. Yet the Department of Ed on this in DC is not very explanatory with how to use it. There's a lot of language, but they're not very committal. But the two things under the US Department of Ed's FAQs deal with, you have to have things to monitor and suppress COVID-19. And they list about 15 items. And the two that, to me, make a lot of sense are implementing physical distancing guidelines, like modified layouts. Sounds like social distancing to me. And redesigning food service facilities, like Suzanne showed, like I showed in some pictures. It seems like it's pretty common sense. We're all trying to do the same thing, limit the spread of COVID-19. In K-12, you can't forget there's still, depending on the state, there's still either bidding requirements or possibly a state contract like Suzanne spoke about. Depending on the state, it could be, you can work off some other cooperative contracts or you're bidding things, but realize that a local school district's policy may or may not be more restrictive than the state. So the state may say you have to bid anything over 25,000. Your school may say 20,000. Or it may say we're just going to follow what the state says. It really just depends. Everyone's different. So you have to confirm that with your district's business office.
Steve, are you ready for a question?
One more thing. The last thing I want to mention is, I think it's critical that you get buy-in from your administration, from your community, and from your boards. If you're going to bring them a purchase, whether it's $10,000, $100,000, $5 million of something like this that's very different than what they've seen before, questions brought up to the administration. So there's got to be a sense of urgency, though. This is money they're not going to see again, likely. It's got to be a lot of planning and a lot of communication. So I think it's very important to get that team on board right at the beginning, and we're already into this a few months with ESSER 3.
Angela would like to know, is this money being allocated to school boards or individual schools? How is it allocated to private schools, and reimbursable expenditure or funded when done directly?
Question. It's being funded to school districts as a whole, and districts that have a higher poverty level measured by Title I, which is free and reduced applications, they get a higher amount effectively per pupil than someone that's a lower free and reduced population. There's some districts, some parish districts in Louisiana who for ESSER 3 are getting over $7,000 a kid. $7,000. And there's some that are getting $1,000 a student. You could then go look and see their poverty level, and you'll see it lines up. I mean, some of them are getting $10,000 to $15,000 per student when you take ESSER 1, 2, and 3. So I'm sorry, the second question was?
Private schools,
private schools, there's money in ESSER 3. I don't know what the allocation was, but there's a minimal amount of money in ESSER 3 for private schools.
something else though.
The school applies.
The school applies. Yeah, the school applies.
It's called something else. I'll find that and we'll
Okay.
send it out to everybody.
And ESSER, and the third question, I'm sorry.
The third question, is it a reimbursable expenditure or funded when it's done directly?
It's funded. Yeah. Questions?
Any questions in the room?
I have a question. So your previous slide, I guess, that talked about like who to get on board is what do you think is the best next step for us to, help educate, some of these individual schools or school boards that may not, have all of this information?
I think most of them are familiar with the money, right? But they may not be familiar with this. I would start, depending on the district, I would start with either curriculum person or their finance person. It really just depends how the district runs. When I was in Novi, we were a team, right? So you probably know who your contact is. I would start with them and say, hey, I was at a webinar and we talked about this. This is an unprecedented amount of money. Did you know that you can do this? And we can send you some school districts that have already spent money this way or have applied for it this way. So I think you just got to start with one of the two of them, and they may already know about it. They may know or they may not, but I think a lot of them don't think outside the box with this. They're thinking, how are we going to spend this? This is a lot of
The other key is like they have to have teams available to, like you said, plan and use it. So does the funds cover the architectural and design fees to plan it?
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to
To
check.
repeat the question to the
No, so
audience.
the question, I'm sorry, the question is, will the ESSER funds and HEERF funds cover the architectural and design fees to do this? The answer I believe is yes. I will confirm that, but I will tell you, you have to be careful with anything under these funds. It's got to fall under the Davis-Bacon Act, which isn't a problem generally with obviously what you're doing. But I believe the answer is yes. I will confirm that. I will tell you this though. I confirmed with an attorney that Davis-Bacon, which means you're paying a certain wage for, you do it with construction and things like that, will not apply to like installation of furniture. So you have people that are installing the furniture, and they're really, if they're just bringing it in, placing it somewhere, not affixing it to walls, you're not really installing it, and they're really just kind of placing it there, right? That's what we're going to say at least. Then that is not subject to the Davis-Bacon Act, which is an important thing to know, because some of your dealer distributors or yourselves, who knows where you fall, wage-wise and stuff. So but I will double check. I'm pretty sure you have no issue with that with the architectural CM type fees.
I just want to add to Rebecca's point. So like in preparation for today, what I ended up doing was going to the principal or the head of facilities and say, who would handle this? And in most cases, it's the development director of the school. They actually are the ones that are going to get with the CFO of the school and then do the application for the funding. And I know it's not people we talk to every day, but then they obviously put teams together all the time. So then we circle that back with the facilities people. And, since we're helping to educate, hopefully that will, connect back with the people that educated them. But yeah, it's pretty much going through CFO like Steve has been and development for applications.
Assuming they have a development person, right? Which may end up being a curriculum
Yeah.
person. Just
Now,
really depends.
We've had the experience so far where the funding then goes back to the Louisiana Department of Education, and then they are making the spend sometimes without connecting back even to the school. So that's a piece that we have to dig into more, unfortunately.
We have another question from our virtual audience. How do ESSER funds relate to GEER funds?
So try to repeat that. How do ESSER funds relate to GEER funds? So the GEER funds, which are from the governor. So that usually came out with ESSER 1. So those are state funds that came from the feds, went to the state, and then the state distributed those to districts. And I don't believe any states, they were competitive. It was really a pass-through again. So I went from the feds to the state. So it's the governor's education. I forgot exactly what it stands for, but every state I believe has those. So similar things. They don't really have the same list of allowable uses, but the intent is the same allowable uses, again, to limit the spread of COVID, technology, so on and so forth. Those were right at the beginning back in 2020. My guess is most people have spent a lot of those funds already.
Do they sunset similarly?
They do sunset. I believe it's going to follow ESSER 1. I'll confirm that, but again, people use that like within the first few months. There were people, again, the critical thing in many districts was getting Chromebooks and laptops. And there were districts that waited 9 to 12 months to get them. You know, this is not just supply chain, it was just the number of people that wanted to get something. So there was no issue with spending the money at the beginning. It's now that, okay, we got all these things in place, what are we gonna spend it on? And I think there are districts struggling with how to spend this money and what they can spend it on. Any more questions? I can call in.
All right, good. Close this out.
Karen, would you like to close this out?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karen Russell. I'm with VS America, and I want to thank AOS today for supporting and sponsoring us as well, to have Steve Marr be able to come and speak to you about finances and how different funds can be used for the interior environments. And if there's anything that we can ever do to help you to expand on this conversation with Steve, with any of our other resources, we are happy to help you in any way that we can. Again, my name is Karen Russell. I'm with VS America, and thank you again to the AOS team for helping us, giving us this opportunity to share this information with you today. And thank you for joining and for giving us your lunch hour. Appreciate it.